Mom's fiance stole my $7,000 college savings and my mom told me to shut up. So I had them arrested. Later found out my dad left me a huge inheritance money which my whole family using. So my mother and her fiance recently got arrested, and my grandparents on my mother's side are giving me a lot of hate for that. This happened because I called the cops on them and I had good reason to do that. My mother and I never got along, especially since my dad passed away 10 years ago. I am 17 right now and in a couple of months, I am supposed to start college. Unfortunately, I had always known that my mother would never have any money set aside for me. So I knew that I would have to work for myself and make my own arrangements. I started working at the age of 14. I would do part-time jobs after school and I had been saving for the past 4 years so that I would have at least some amount set aside. I would also often get cash from my relatives on my birthdays as gifts, and even sometimes on the holidays, so I would set that aside as well, and so far, I had saved up almost $7,000, and I was pretty happy about it. It was all in cash, of course, and I kept it safely tucked away in a little corner of my cupboard in a wooden box that my father had carved out for me. I did not have a bank account because my mother never allowed me to create one, so that was out of the question. But I had never told my mom or anybody else about that, so I don't know how anybody was able to find it. Anyway, a couple of days ago, I found that the box was entirely empty. When I asked my mom about it, she told me that her fiancé had taken the money to invest in his new house. I completely lost my mind when I found out what happened. There was a huge fight in the house with me on one side and my mom and her fiancé on the other. But at the end of the day, I'm just 17 and they are in power right now, so I had to concede, and the only thing that I could do. I walked up to my room, locked myself in, and cried for hours because this was my life and I would have to start from scratch yet again. I wasn't even sure if I would be able to save enough money for anything before college and I was just really disheartened and completely lost. That was the day that I made up my mind. I was going to get back at them for this because this could not go unanswered. It was pretty big, but thankfully, I was able to get my revenge exactly 3 days later. And now, they have been arrested and are paying for the crime that they committed. My only problem in this entire scenario is that my grandparents, who had always been on my side so far, are now against me, and it just doesn't make sense to me anymore. My mom's fiancé, I'll call him Rob, has been in my life for the past 2 years, and I've hated every single second of it because he is literally one of the most terrible people I have ever met. I would even go to the extent of calling him abusive, probably not physically but verbally and emotionally, definitely abusive. My mom usually bears the brunt of it, but occasionally, he loses his temper with me as well and says whatever comes to his mind. He curses me out, tries his very best to make me cry like my mother, and gets even more pissed off, and he realizes that I don't care, which leads him to lose even more control of his tongue and what he says. And my mother never bothers to defend me. My mother did not date anybody for the first couple of years after my dad passed away, but then, she met Rob and for the first few months, he was nice and tolerable, but then, they had their first big fight and that's when he started showing his true colors. 6 months into the relationship, he had already started manipulating my mom and had let him move in with us. He was a no-good, deadbeat, idiot, and could barely stick to any job. For context, he is in his 30s, mid to late, and he still relies on his parents for money occasionally because he has absolutely zero financial sense and is constantly wasting money, way more than what he earns. When he's fighting with my mom, he takes money from his parents, and when he's not fighting with my mom, he's comfortable enough to leech off of her. The sad part is that my mother isn't exactly a billionaire who can afford to support her partner who wants to lead an extravagant lifestyle. She is the floor supervisor at our local supermarket, and while she brings home a decent amount, it's not enough for the kind of lifestyle that Rob wants. Anyway, I never let it become a problem for me. I always try to be as independent as I can. Right from the age of 14, I have tried to avoid asking my mother for anything, apart from my basic necessities, and after I started working part-time, I wouldn't even ask her to pay for those. I don't ask my mother to buy me anything, and the only thing that I rely on her for is probably just shelter and food. That's it. I don't ask her to do anything extra for me or go out of her way because I know that even expecting that is pretty foolish. She has made it very clear to me right from the beginning that she doesn't like me. Even when I was a child, she was never very nice to me, and I always had this feeling that she did not even want me as I grew older. That feeling strengthened into a belief. At least before, I had my dad to have my back and stand up to my mom whenever she would get a little too pissed at me, but after he passed away, I was on my own, and that's how it has been for the past couple of years. Things just started getting worse when Rob came around, but I always consoled myself by telling myself that soon enough, I would go away for college and then, I wouldn't have to worry about any of this. Now, that seems bleak and unlikely to happen. For the 3 days after my money was taken away from me, I just stayed in my room and did not do anything because I was just so depressed. The day after I learned that all my money had been taken away from me, we moved into our new house and I did all the work that I was required to do, but I did not speak to either of the 2 people living with me, and they did not seem any worse for it either. On the 3rd day, my mother told me that I had to get dressed in the evening because they were hosting a housewarming party. So I started screaming at her, and I told her that I was not going to do anything of this sort because she had taken my money from me, and the only reason they had been able to seal the deal and buy this house was because of the money that they had stolen from me. That really pissed my mother off, and she told me that now that we were finally living in our own house and not a rented place, I should be happy for them. And I need to just suck it up and let this one go because I owe them for life anyway, referring to the fact that she had raised me, which doesn't even make sense because that was something she was legally bound to do, and it was not like she did me any huge favors. And as for the house, it was too big for the 3 of us anyway. I knew that they had bought this house just to be able to impress everybody with their upmarket address and spacious home. I was really upset that day, and I did something that I hadn't done before, so I decided to call up my father's parents. It was kind of complicated because after my dad had passed away, my paternal grandparents had sort of distanced themselves from our family because it was too painful to keep in touch, I guess. I don't know why, they had just cut ties with us and we were not on speaking terms anymore. But I still had their numbers and I decided to call them, as sort of a last resort, since my maternal grandparents, whom I had a better relationship with, were actually kind of neutral in this context. The day that my money had been stolen, I had told my mom's parents about it because I had expected them to talk to my mom and fix this for me, but they had just told me that they wanted my mother to be able to buy a new house and they were happy about it, but on the bright side, we would finally have a place of our own and wouldn't have to worry about rent every month. So they told me to look on the bright side and find the silver lining of this. I thought that it was a pretty weird reaction from them since so far, they were always trying to be on my side. They would never exactly say anything to my mom, but they would always sympathize with me. However, this time, things were very different and I didn't understand that reaction. I was very pissed with them as well, so I did not contact them after that. And on the day that my mom told me to suck it up, I decided to contact my grandparents, hoping to get some other sort of response from them, one that would give me some hope for the future at least. I don't know what it was, just a gut feeling that told me to call them, and so I did. Thankfully, they answered my call as well, and as soon as they picked up, I told them everything that had happened. I told them that I knew they were too hurt to talk to us and did not want to keep in touch, but this was an emergency and if my dad was still alive, he would have wanted to help me out right now. I told them, my mother had taken my money from me and I have been working so hard for the past couple of years to be able to afford to go to college, but now, I don't even know if that's going to happen. After telling them, my grandfather told me that this was really confusing because apparently, my dad had actually left a college fund for me. So he had no idea why I would need to save up money separately. That was news to me because my mother had literally never said anything about this, and I had never asked her either because I had just assumed that she would not have any money set aside for me. But I had totally forgotten that before my dad passed away, he might have done something for me. After all, he knew that he was going to pass away, but he had died so young that I had just assumed that maybe he might not have time for me. So when my grandparents told me about this little bit of information, I found that to be really interesting. I was pretty pissed off and frustrated by that point, so I asked my grandparents if they had any proof that they could send to me, which I would be able to use against my mom. And they told me that they were going to look for some documents and would call me later. For the next couple of hours, I just waited in my room and tried to piece everything together. And I realized that my mom and Rob had definitely teamed up and swiped my college fund to use for themselves, so that they could buy this house because as far as I was concerned, I did not think that my mother made enough money to purchase the house, and as for Rob, he had not even been employed anywhere for the past 3 months, so I highly doubt that it was within his means to buy a house like this. I just needed something to be able to confirm this and then, I would report them to the police. After waiting for a couple of hours, my grandparents finally reached out to me and sent me photos of some documents, which my mother had literally signed that she would use the money that my father was leaving her to pay for my college tuition and to make sure that I led a comfortable life. I literally laughed out loud when I read that because she had done everything but ensured that my life was comfortable. In fact, I think she went out of her way to make my life more uncomfortable. Anyway, she had signed those documents and it really pissed me off that my grandparents had never brought it up before. They had just dropped me after my dad passed away, and everybody had abandoned me. My mother had never really been there for me. My mother and grandparents tried to be there for me, but I think it was all an act, and my dad's parents were too caught up in their own grief to care about me. When I asked my grandparents why they had never shown these papers before, their excuse was pretty lame and they told me that they had kind of forgotten about it after my dad passed away, and at the time, I was too young anyway. And once I got older,